Welcome everyone to this Virtual Health Information Network webinar. My name is Lisa Meehan. I'm Deputy Director of the New Zealand Policy Research Institute, and it's my pleasure today to introduce Amelia Guha. She's giving a webinar today on the effects of labour market entry conditions on income, the role of family background. So Amelia, until very recently, was an advisor at the Productivity Commission, and I guess most of you will know that unfortunately, as part that closed down just a couple of weeks ago at the end of February. That was part of the ACT National Coalition Agreement. And in happier news, Amelia also very recently, just a couple of weeks ago, she just told us on exactly the same day that Productivity Commission closed down, she defended her PhD. So it's a much happier, nicer milestone.
Hi, today I will be talking about one of the papers from my thesis where I'm looking at the effect of labor market entry conditions on income and the role of family background in the context. But of course, before I start, I need to give the disclaimer that these results are not official statistics and that they have been created for research purposes only and is very carefully managed by Stats New Zealand. Now, increasing evidence in literature suggests that graduating during adverse labor market conditions can have very long-term and persistent effects on earnings for young graduates. While other job seekers and experienced workers also suffer due to job loss or pay cut, these particular young entrants are very vulnerable because they are at the beginning of a very productive phase in their career when earnings growth is as steep as it typically is for such people. And they also tend to quickly switch between their jobs towards better and more higher paying jobs. Therefore, starting out one's career during such a time, during a recession, can affect such people and have really long-term effects on their earnings. Research also shows that family background can have important effect or vital outcomes for their children's labor market outcomes. In the light of that, in this paper, I study if graduating during adverse labor market conditions can have short-term and long-term effects on individuals, and if family background plays any role in the outcomes for such undergraduates in New Zealand. The hypothesis behind this is that labor market models show that accumulation of skill together with an efficient search and matching process can have really important effect on initial earnings for these students, right? So when these students graduate during a loose labor market, what might happen is they might get stuck in lower productivity firms, or there might be a severe mismatch where what they're looking for and what they actually find in a job isn't quite the right match. And this might be exacerbated in situations where there is a stigma effect going on, which essentially means that these young graduates who are either unemployed or underemployed tend to find it very difficult to find a job in the future because their future employers take their job history as a negative signal for their own productivity. Now, if searching and matching is what is underlying this entire process, then parents with better backgrounds and networking system can actually help out their children either by looking for jobs for their kids, or they might refer their children to prospective employers. The data in the study comes from integrated data infrastructure, and I create an individual level panel data set, which comes from various different sources, such as the earnings information comes from the IR data, and university level information comes from Ministry of Education data, and other background information comes from Department of Internal Affairs source. And the final working sample includes individuals who have graduated with an undergraduate degree between 2002 and 2018. The sample is restricted to full-time students only and to students that have graduated. And this graduation age is also restricted between 21 and 25 years of age. Now, while the main sample consists of males, this analysis is also extended to other samples, such as females, people from other ethnicities, and siblings. Finally, we come to about 436,000 individual level observations. For our main dependent variable, I include an inverse hyperbolic sine transformation of annual income. And the reason behind including this instead of a log transformation, which is generally used in literature, is because it has an added advantage of allowing us to include zero-valued observations. So people say who have no income or zero income are also included in this analysis. And we use national unemployment rate as an indication of the labor market condition at the time of graduation. Other variables that are also included in the analysis are one, there is a delay variable, which is a dummy, which equals 1 if an individual takes longer than the average of 3 years to complete an undergraduate degree. And also a mobility dummy, which equals 1 if an individual chooses to move from their region of graduation for a job. And the interest of including them in the model is to capture the effects of delaying graduation and mobility on earnings. Further, we go on to control for age and age square as well. The first table here gives a summary table for the two main samples included. Sorry, I'll just remove this so I can see what I'm looking at. Yeah, so this table gives a summary table for the two main samples that is included in the analysis. One is the full sample, and that includes everybody. And then there is a sibling sample, which I will talk more in detail about in the coming slides. So for the full sample, the average income is about $35,000, and there is a national unemployment rate is about 5%. Potential experience, which is defined as the number of years from graduation, is about at 3.5 years. And true or actual experience, which is the number of years after graduation where that individual has positive income, is slightly lower at 3.19 years. Graduation age is at about 22 years. 34% of the sample is male, and 46% of the sample has delayed graduation, and 22% has moved after graduation. Majority of the sample, about 71%, is white, followed by 17% Asian and 7% Maori. In the next slide here, we have national unemployment rate for the first graph between the study time that I have in my sample. As we can see here, initially there is an increased unemployment rate, probably due to the remaining effects of the Asian crisis in the late 90s, which keeps going down. And then it soars up again during the global financial crisis and goes up to about 7%, and then drops down gradually again. This variation in the unemployment rate is what we use in the analysis of our study. And the next graph here is the regional unemployment rate of New Zealand during the same time. The important things to note here is that the overall trend seems to be quite similar to the national unemployment rate here, and that there seems to be quite a bit of correlation between the different regional unemployment rates, with Northland having the highest and Southland having the lowest unemployment rates. Now, while I do use regional unemployment rate as a robustness check in the study, the main unemployment rate used in the study is the national unemployment rate. And the main reason behind doing that is that New Zealand is a small country with higher mobility amongst young workers. So it seems quite logical to think that the national unemployment rate should be the appropriate indicator of labor market condition at graduation. Moving on, the next figure here gives an earnings and experience profile by graduation cohort. The dotted line here gives the average income for the first year for each of these cohorts. And it shows that for the initial 2 to 3 years after entering the labor market, there is a very steep growth in income, as one would expect, and then it slowly flattens out. And this trend seems to be quite similar to the graphs from the analysis that come out of US or Canada. And it seems like all of these cohorts out here seems to have a very similar trend of initial increase and then a sudden slag after that, but it will be more formally tested in the next sections. But when we look at the graph to the right here, where it is looking at the same experience and earnings profile just by different genders, we see a very interesting picture that is being painted here. While for many of the cohorts, women actually start with a higher average income as compared to men. and do seem to have a very similar trend for at least initial years. Women flatten out very quickly after 3 years of entering the labor market, while men tend to keep growing up. And this opens up gender wage gap questions after about 3 years of entering the labor market. There are several papers in the literature that talks about this and gives us several reasons as to why this happens, including matching and sorting and the different kind of jobs and preferences and women who choose to have children and the number of hours that they choose to work and so on. But nevertheless, it's still a very interesting graph to look at because it talks about what's going on in New Zealand between the different genders. Now, there are two main econometric approaches in this paper. The first is following the literature for an individual level. So for an individual I in the year T, our main dependent variable is the IHS transformed real income. And the unemployment rate here is the national unemployment rate at the time of graduation. And the beta here gives us the effect, the initial effect of unemployment rate on earnings after graduation. The coefficient on the interaction term here between unemployment rate and experience gives us the subsequent effects of unemployment rate at graduation on earnings with experience profile. Next term here is the current unemployment rate, which is the regional unemployment rate at the region of residence for an individual, taken at the time when the earnings is captured here. And the intention of including this into the model is to basically capture the effect of any subsequent economic shocks on earnings to separate that effect from the effect of the unemployment rate at the time of graduation. Moving on, I also include experience into the model to capture the effect of experience on earnings. And it also controls for other factors such as age, squared of age, mobility and delay, and fixed effects for calendar year. But if we choose to agree that family background can actually play an important role in the labor market outcomes for these students, then not controlling for the heterogeneity between families can actually lead to a biasness in the results discussed in the previous slide. To test that, I include a siblings sample in this model here, where we have male siblings that have biological parents, same biological parents, and the male siblings all have individual, they have undergraduate degrees that are exposed to different labor market conditions. And the idea is to include a sibling fixed effect into the model that allows for capturing unobserved family background characteristics, such as upbringing, networking, and so on. This allows for other advantages into the model, such as since siblings on an average share about 50% of their genetic characteristics, it somewhat releases the effect that of omitted variable bias, where there might be a concern that not including genetic information into the earnings model might create a bias. In this section here, I will talk about the different threats into the identification of the effect of labor market conditions on income. The first being selection into university. So there might be a concern that labor market conditions during graduation at school might also induce some individuals who wouldn't have otherwise attended university attend during such conditions just because of a lower opportunity cost. Now, if that happens, that introduces a selection problem into these individual cohorts, and this might further affect the earnings when they graduate from the university. To test that, I look at the effect of unemployment rate at school graduation on the probability of attending university. And while the effect here is positive, it is insignificant. So that relieves us of the worry to an extent. I further go ahead and look into the differences, the differences of the students that attend university and the students that don't, for their different characteristics, such as their school performance, their parents' age, parents' education, family income, as a function of labor market condition when they're graduating from school. And it seems like if you look at the interaction effect here between school unemployment rate and university attendance, the effect is overall insignificant except for parents' age. So on an overall basis, it seems like there is no selection effect going on here based off the labor market conditions during graduation at school. The other threat could be selection into employment, where when students graduate and they see that the labor market condition right now isn't the best and there aren't many people hiring us. So there might be some people who choose to not enter the labor market and choose to wait till conditions are better. If that happens, then that will again introduce a selection problem into the analysis and bias the results. To test that, I look at the effect of unemployment rate at graduation on the probability of working within the first year after graduating here and second year after graduating by varying the number of controls that we have. And the effect overall seems insignificant, except this one here where the effect is marginal. So at least it limits our concerns to a certain extent. But this is not to say this is the best way to test this, but at least this is a data-driven approach to see what's going on in the sample that we have in hand. The other concern would be that the timing of graduation is exogenous to the labor market conditions at the time. This means that students who graduate may choose to either delay their graduation by either going for a master's or a higher degree, or they can delay their graduation by choosing more papers or a major. If that happens, that is again a problem in identification. And so to test that out, I look at the unemployment rate in the previous year, the year when they actually make the decision to either graduate or not, and the share of delayed students compared to the number of undergraduates in the previous year and the share of masters. And preliminarily, it seems like there is no real correlation going on between the unemployment rate in the previous year and the choices to either delay or go for a master's. To further test that out, I also look at the effect of the previous year's unemployment rate on the choices to delay or go for masters by male and female samples, and the effect seems insignificant. And the last threat to be concerned about is when students graduate in such a recession time or so, and they might think that, well, it's probably best to go for a different local labor market to find a job. And if there is a differential selection into who chooses to move as a response to the labor market condition, then that might again bias my results. To test that out, I look at a similar regression at the effect of previous year's unemployment rate on mobility by different male and female samples, and the effect still seems insignificant. Now coming to our main results here. The first 4 columns here are for the male sample, and panel B is giving the effect of the unemployment rate for selected years of experience here, such as first year, 5th year, and 10th year. In the first column here, we include potential experience, which is the variable that is more widely used in the literature. And 2 of the reasons why they use potential experience instead of actual experience is, one, either their data does not account for actual experience and therefore they have to rely on potential experience, or they're not aware of the timing of graduation in their data. But due to the rich data that we have in hand, we choose to go ahead and also include true experience instead of potential experience. And we find that even after including all of our controls, the effect is negative and significant, as is what we see in the literature for all of the other countries. While mobility and delay seems to have a positive and significant effect for all samples included here. However, the effect seems to is there only for the first year, and for the subsequent years, it seems to not exist. So it is a short-term effect. However, for the females here, it seems like there is not much of an effect, although it is quite difficult to compare male and female samples just because of the differences in their choices and the number of hours worked and so on. But still, on an overall effect, it seems like females don't seem to have an effect. And the main effect in the male is probably drawn by the white population in our sample. And we do not see as much of an effect on the non-white population.
Wayland had a question about, could you clarify how you interpret the coefficients?
So in the coefficients here, for this one, we look at this basically gives us the effect of the initial year of unemployment rate effect on the earnings for the first year. And the interaction effect here gives us the effect of subsequent years. So after the first year, what happens once the experience keeps increasing? So it seems like the effect is negative and significant, but that's probably only for the initial year. It doesn't seem to exist for the years that comes after with increase in experience.
So what's the unit of the outcome variable? I don't know how to interpret 0.7. For example,
okay.
first column, 0.3, what does that mean?
So for an increase in 1 percentage point in the unemployment rate, there seems to be the interpretation here is similar to the log interpretations. So there seems to be 7.2% increase in decrease, in earnings.
Got it. Thanks.
Right. Okay. Moving on. Coming to the sibling sample that we have here, in the first column, we take the sibling sample of male siblings that have undergraduate degree, and we run the same model that we had in the previous one without any fixed effects for sibling or any controls. And the effect seems to be very negative and significant and runs up to about 5 years. But when we move on and add all of the controls, we go back to the result that we had previously got. So the effect is negative and significant only for the first year. It remains negative, but is insignificant for the subsequent years. But once we add sibling fixed effects into the model, we see that the effect becomes insignificant. It remains negative, but the effect drops to almost half of what we have seen here previously. And this remains so even when we include delay and mobility variables into the model. So it seems like once we control for family background characteristics, the effect that we see actually vanishes. So to summarize what we see here in the results, when we rerun what was done in the literature, we find, yes, there is a negative effect of earnings, but only for the initial year. Whereas if you look at the literature for other countries like US and Canada, the effect is much long drawn. But once we control for family background heterogeneity, which was not done previously, we see that labor market really doesn't matter for earnings. And this might indicate that family background characteristics and family networking, specifically for a small country like New Zealand, may have a role to play as an insurance against such labor market shocks during such times.
Thank you so much for that, Amelia. That's really interesting because we often quote the overseas literature that talks about time of graduation and how it has a long-lasting effect on earnings. So it's really good to have some New Zealand-specific evidence in this area. So compared to, say, the overseas literature, do you think there's anything here in terms of New Zealand could, I don't know if this is true, but New Zealand could overall have actually just a lower unemployment rate even during bad economic times, and whether that might also influence the result?
Yeah, that's a good point, and that's probably true because if you look at the effect of unemployment rates, I mean, it varies by different countries, and this kind of study has been done for many different countries. The highest effect obviously is seen in US and Canada, which were probably the worst affected, specifically given the recession that I'm taking into consideration is the global financial crisis. So if you look at the literature from US and Canada, the effects are very long drawn and much higher as compared to what we see in New Zealand and as compared to what we see in many of the other European countries as well. And yes, the effect does vary, but even then, as compared to any of the literature that has been done so far, the effect in New Zealand seems to be lower.
So did I get that right from your kind of initial check? You said you looked at the share of people who find a job within 1 year. isn't that kind of surprising that there is no real effect? Does this suggest that there is no real effect on from these kind of recessions on your sample of graduates? Maybe they're not that affected by the unemployment rate, or am I misinterpreting that?
Well, the way I interpreted that as that there seems to be no selection effect on who chooses to get into the job market based on labor market conditions. And also there seems to be no real effect on people, whether or not they're getting a job. What seems to be the effect is an effect on earnings, that is, people are probably getting into lower earnings. And that might be because, as we see in another chapter in the same thesis, where I'm looking at the underlying mechanism behind why this is happening, and I look into the firm characteristics and all of that, into like what kind of jobs are these people really going into when they are graduating during a recession. And it seems like the effect is probably due to their actually joining smaller, less productive firms, and therefore the effect is what we see on earnings, instead of like an entire job loss, like people are not really getting a job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess there could also be differences in terms of, even if they find a job, how many hours they work, and maybe they have to, I don't know, compensate, work more hours for less hourly pay to compensate for
I mean,
for worse jobs.
Exactly. I mean, that would be, I mean, that would be a very important thing to look at. But unfortunately, so far, IDI doesn't have great data on hours worked so far. So, I mean, it would be very interesting to look at, but it is not supported by the data currently.
Thanks.
So I was just wondering, because what you're looking at here is really just one cycle. Was there any difference over, say, between 2002 at the beginning and say 2009 when the unemployment rate was higher? Was there any big difference in just the overall bachelor's degree participation rate over that time period? Because then you might think that, for example, the composition of people who are studying is different.
If you mean cohort size, I looked at the cohort size for the different years. And if we not take into consideration the initial year of 2002 and probably part of 2003, and if we move on, just because of data quality, if we move on, and there seems to be not a huge difference in the cohort sizes year on year. And that could be because, I mean, there could be a lot of things going on in the early 2002 and 2003 cohorts. It could be a data issue or other factors. But so far from what I have done, I can't confidently say what's really going on. But if we move on and look at the effect from 2004 and onwards, the cohort size more or less remains stable throughout.
Okay. That's what I thought, that the big increase in tertiary participation happened a little bit earlier than what you're looking at, but I couldn't quite remember.
I just wondered about the sibling model. A couple of things regarding the sibling model. One, how you identified siblings. If it's through birth records, which in my experience is kind of the easiest way to do things, that would necessarily restrict your sample to New Zealand-born people, wouldn't it?
Yes.
So I guess the conclusions are restricted to may not apply to not New Zealand born. That's one. And the other one, my understanding was you've got a male who you paired with another male in the family, and means there must be at least two males in the family, making them possibly larger families. And I wonder what effect that may have had on your results. Larger families tend to be worse off socioeconomically. I just wondered if you thought through those impacts. And I suppose another question related to that is, if you restricted your original sample to those who had siblings, do you get the same results if you just run the same analysis again, not comparing to siblings, but just the same analysis for those? So are they different in any way, I guess is the overall question.
Okay, so for the first question here, given that larger families, if I look into the number of siblings I have in the sample that I have in hand right now, they generally, so I'm only including families that have only male siblings in the main analysis, right? So the number of siblings runs from about 2, obviously 2, to 4. So there is if you're talking about larger families, that typically talks about people who have more siblings, runs to about a mixed number of, that generally includes mixed siblings, and those families are not included in the analysis that I run here. So that's not included. So they're generally, they're families, but they're not as large as compared to many of the other families that are included. And as far as the variation in socioeconomic backgrounds in those families, I'm not quite sure. I haven't really looked at that at this stage. I probably could.
Wellen.
Yeah. So one question I have is, so you mentioned about that it's probably pretty easy for people to for prospective labor to move around, to go to other local labor markets.
Yeah.
Do you have direct evidence that when regional unemployment rate is higher, it's more likely for them to move to other regions for getting a job?
Yeah, so that's what I looked at in one of the threats section, right? So I looked at the effect of unemployment rate on mobility, and it seemed like there was no real effect of unemployment rate. And probably the reason behind that is because mobility in New Zealand, within New Zealand market, is quite high anyway, and it may not be particularly as an effect of a higher unemployment rate. But this is to mention that in this particular analysis, do not have data regarding migration to other countries, specifically to Australia, which seems to be what's happening in New Zealand anyway, probably because Australia is very close and New Zealand is a small country, and that's a bigger labor market. But now it was sad that I don't have that data, but I, on the other hand, did look at the unemployment rate and the publicly available migration data, and I looked at that age gap of between 20 to 24 years, and I thought that there is no real correlation between unemployment rate and migration into other countries either. This is a preliminary analysis, obviously. I mean, it would be much better if I actually had the data, but this is the best I can do with what I have in hand.
Got it. Thanks.
One not question but comment, because I don't think it's an issue, is like some people have issues with these kind of sibling fixed effects because of birth order effects, because like there is some international literature which shows that firstborn children have like higher income than later born children. And this could be a problem for you, I think, only if there is like a long-term trend in the unemployment rate, so that like later born children within a family always have like a higher or lower unemployment rate compared to earlier born children. But I think for you it's not a problem because you have like these more fluctuations over time. So I think that's good for you. But yeah, you could mention it somewhere.
I did also run a robustness check with including the birth order in the analysis. And while in some cases it seemed like the birth order comes out to be significant, it doesn't change the overall story. So the effect of the unemployment rate still remains quite insignificant, even if preferences do matter between the siblings.
If there's no more questions, I'll say thank you so much, Amelia. And it was one of those presentations where I keep thinking, but how about this? And then on your next slide, you've already considered it. So very thorough research. So thank you very much. And thank you for everyone for attending.